My name is Tonya Blevins. I'm 41 years old, and at my sister-in-law's wedding, my mother-in-law stood up in front of 200 people with a wooden box in her hands. The envelope on top of it had my name on it, in my dead mother's handwriting. She'd been dead a year and a half. I said it before I decided to. Ma'am, that one's mine. The tent went the way a room goes when somebody drops a glass. Marjan Blevins looked at me down the whole length of it over the punch bowl. Over 200 rosemary napkins I'd tied myself that morning. Over every person I've served breakfast to since I was 22. And she used her church voice on me. Sit down, Tonya. You've had your day. Nobody moved. Somebody's little boy asked his mother a question and got shushed. The band had stopped between songs and didn't start. And I stood there in a dress I'd bought at the outlet in Delcamp, with a paper plate in my hand, looking at my mother's handwriting on an envelope that had never been opened. Here's what nobody under that tent knew. I'd had the lid of that box in my hand 8 weeks before, on a Thursday afternoon, in her sewing room, with an armload of tablecloths over my other arm. I'd asked her about it in her own kitchen with the coffee on, and I hadn't told one other soul in this county. And not because I was building anything. I just couldn't find a way to say it out loud that didn't set a wedding on fire. Welcome back to Porch Stories, where the quiet ones who were raised to say thank you finally ask for what was already theirs. If you're the one they call a peach and never call to ask, this one's yours. Tell me in the comments what somebody's still holding for you. I read them. And subscribe, because the part that put me on my own kitchen floor wasn't the money. Let me take you back 12 years. But before I take you to the wedding, I've got to show you the town, because you can't understand what 138 envelopes meant to me unless you know who wrote them. Chalk Hill, Alabama. 1,400 people if you count the ones out past the water tower. One square, one light, and on the north side of that square there's a place called The Kettle, where I have waited tables for 19 years. Dottie Tidwell owns it. She's 66, and she's had it since she was 31. And she has never once in that time put a menu in anybody's hands, because if you're in there, she already knows what you want, and if you're new, she'll tell you. She wears her glasses on a beaded chain her granddaughter made her, and she keeps the radio on the farm report and turns it down for nobody. Not the preacher, not the mayor, not the state trooper who comes in Tuesdays. Peggy Bagwell works the front with me. 58, 4 grandbabies. And she runs a police scanner under the register on low all day long, so she'll be the first to know anything. When something comes over it, she doesn't say what. She just goes very still with a coffee pot in her hand, and then says, And you can spend a whole shift waiting her out. I open, 5:30 in the morning, 6 days a week. I unlock the front, I start 2 urns, I put down the mats, and by 10 till 6 there's 4 trucks in the lot with their lights on and their engines running. And every one of those men has been coming in so long, they've got a stool with a dent in it. Aubrey Pate has the last stool by the register. He's 88. He was a lineman for the co-op for 41 years, and he has one hand that doesn't fully close. And he takes his coffee light with 2 sugars, and he has never in 11 years let me put it in front of him without saying, well, there she is. His dog Dennis rides in the truck. Dennis is 14, and he's some kind of a mix, and he's got exactly one job in this life, which is to wait, and around 8:15, I take a sausage patty out on a saucer, and Dennis performs that job like a man collecting a pension. I'm telling you about a diner, because I need you to understand something about my life before any of the rest of it. I know what 900 people in this county take in their coffee. I know which ones are getting divorced before their own mothers do. I know which table's about to leave a tract instead of a tip, and which quiet man in a work jacket puts a folded 20 under the sugar caddy when his wife's not looking. I have never been anybody important in Chalk Hill, but there is not a soul in it whose breakfast I have not carried. My mother was Imogene Dockery, and everybody called her Miss Imogene, including 3 or 4 people older than she was. She worked 26 years on the deboning line at the poultry plant over in Delcamp. If you don't know what that is, it's a room they keep at 40 degrees on purpose, and you stand in it, and thighs come at you on a belt, and you take a knife to them for 8 hours in a rubber apron with your hands wet the whole time. Her hands were a wreck by 50. Both thumbs went crooked. There's a way she'd hold a coffee cup, with the fingers all together like a mitten. And if you'd never seen it, you'd think she was being dainty. She raised me on that plant, and one funeral. My daddy was Lloyd Dockery, and he drove a rock truck for the county, and he came out of a shift on a Friday in October and sat down on the bumper of his own truck in the plant lot where he'd gone to pick her up, and he was gone before the ambulance made the turn. He was 48. I was 19, and I was standing behind the counter at the kettle when Dottie came around and took the coffee pot out of my hand and said, "Honey, sit down." That week taught my mother something, and it took her the rest of her life to finish paying for the lesson. She hadn't known what it cost. Nobody tells you. She sat in a room with a man in a good suit and picked out the second cheapest of everything, and it still came to more than she made in 3 months, and she paid it off over 4 years, with the plant taking a bite every other Friday. And the week after we buried him, she started the bag. It was a bread bag. She'd rinse one out and dry it over the faucet, and that's what she used. And she'd fold the money flat and put a rubber band around it, and it went in the deep freeze on the back porch, at the bottom, underneath a bag of butter beans she'd put up herself. I asked her once why she didn't just take it to the bank. She said the bank knows what you've got. She said a purse gets stolen, and a mattress gets found, and a bank gets told. And then came the line I've replayed in my own head about 4,000 times since. Everybody looks in a purse, Tonya. Nobody looks under a butter bean. We called it the butter bean money. It was a family joke, and it was also completely serious, the way the best ones are. If I said something about her old car, she'd say, "Well, I'm not spending the butter beans on a fan belt." If she got a raise, she'd say, "The butter beans had a good year." My daughter Sadie learned the phrase before she learned what it meant, the way kids do, and used to think her grandmother had a magic freezer. That money was the only thing on this earth my mother ever put first. She was not going to hand me a bill for putting her in the ground. She'd carried one and she knew exactly what it weighed, and she decided when I was 19 that I wasn't going to. My husband is Jimmy Blevins. He drives a propane truck on a route that runs out past the county line, and he's got a laugh you can hear across a parking lot, and he's the kindest man I've ever stood next to, and you're going to want to be angry at him at least once before this is over. So am I. We'll get there. We've got one, Sadie, and she's 11, and she reads at the table and gets in trouble for it, and I've never once meant it. She's got my mother's hands, long in the palm, and she plays the trombone, which she chose herself out of pure contrariness because a boy told her it was a boy's instrument. That's what I had. A counter, a dog on a saucer, a woman with a scanner, a girl with a trombone, and a deep freeze on my mother's back porch with a bread bag under the butter beans. Now, let me tell you about the Blevinses. There is a building on the west side of the square in Chalk Hill, with a transom over the door, and the glass in that transom still says Blevins in gold leaf with a shadow painted under the letters. It's an insurance office now. It was a hardware store for 61 years, and before that, it was a feed store, and the man who put that glass in was Jimmy's great-grandfather. The Blevinses do not have money. They have not had money since the spring of 1988. What they have is the glass and a pew, and 4 generations in the cemetery behind the Methodist church. And in a town of 1,400 people, that's not nothing. It's not nothing at all. When a Blevins walks into a room in Chalk Hill, the room adjusts about a 1/4 inch. Marjan Blevins is 74. She's small. She's got a way of standing with her hands folded at her waist that makes other women stop leaning. She's run the Methodist kitchen for 31 years and the flower calendar for 22, and she has buried a husband and put 3 children through school on a church secretary's salary and whatever the Lord provided. And there is not one person in that town who would tell you she was anything but a fine Christian woman. I want that on the record, because it's true, and because it's the whole problem. The first time I ever sat at her table, she asked me 2 questions: where my people were from and what my mother did. I said Chalk Hill, both sides, 4 generations. I said my mother worked at the plant in Delcamp. She said, "On the line?" I said, "Yes, ma'am, on the line, 22 years at that point." And she said, "Well, bless her heart." And she got up and got the rolls. I was 28 years old, and I sat there and thought I'd gotten off easy. It took me about 6 years to understand that in that one exchange, I had been weighed, filed, and put where I was going to stay, and that everything gracious that came after was the gracious you show a person who is not going anywhere. Jimmy's daddy was Melvin Blevins, and he died the year before I met Jimmy, so all I've got of him is stories, and one photograph on Margine's hall table of a big man in a feed cap holding a catfish like it owed him money. Melvin lost the store. That's the sentence the family uses, all 4 words, and then somebody changes the subject. Melvin's brother Burl is 81 and still going. Burl Blevins wears a hearing aid he turns off on purpose, which everybody in the family knows, and which he does not deny. He'll sit through an entire Thanksgiving with it off, and eat 2 plates, and then turn it on at the exact second something interesting happens. Remember Burl. He's got one line in this story, and it takes the roof off. And then there's Shelby. Shelby Blevins is Jimmy's baby sister. She was 21 when I married in, and she's 33 now. And I'm going to be fair to her, because she's earned it, but I have to be honest first. Shelby has never in her life had to figure out how something was going to get done. It got done. She's not lazy, and she's not mean. She was simply born into a house where there was one child everything was arranged around, and it wasn't Jimmy, and it wasn't their middle brother who lives in Georgia now and calls twice a year. At every gathering I have ever attended in that house, there is a moment, about 10 minutes before we eat, where Marjan comes to the doorway and finds a face, and for 12 years the face has been mine. "Tonya, honey, would you?" And I'd get up, and Shelby would be on the couch with her shoes off. I did not resent it. That would make a tidier story than the one I've got, and it isn't true. I wasn't quietly seething for 12 years. I liked being useful. I'm good at it. I have carried plates for a living since I was 22, and there is a real pleasure in being the one who knows where the extra chairs are. The trouble isn't that they let me carry things. The trouble is what a family concludes about a woman who carries things without being asked twice. They conclude she doesn't need anything. Our wedding was in June, 12 years ago, at the Methodist Church, with the reception in the fellowship hall, because the barn out at Yarnell Farm wasn't a wedding venue yet. It was still a barn. My mother made the mince. Dottie closed the kettle for a day, which she has done 4 times in 35 years, and every one of those 4 times it was for a funeral except mine. 138 people signed the book. I know that number the way you know your own phone number, and I'm going to tell you later exactly how I came to know it, because that number is the whole spine of this thing. We had a gift table along the wall under the windows, with a cloth on it, and it filled up the way they do the toaster, the towels, 3 crock pots, a set of everyday dishes from Jimmy's aunt in Georgia, and at the end of the table, there was a box. The box is walnut, about as long as your forearm, and it's got a hinged lid and a slot cut in the top, and a brass plate on the front with nothing engraved on it. Melvin's mother had it made in 1960-something by a man in Delcamp who did cabinets. Every Blevins wedding since has put it on the table. I came out of the ladies' room at maybe 8 o'clock with my shoes in my hand, because my feet were done, and Marjan was standing at the end of that table with the box in her arms. She said, "Let me take that off you, honey." And then she said the sentence. 12 years I have carried it around like a pocket knife I didn't know I had. That's all a family is, a place to set things down. I thought it was the kindest thing anybody said to me the whole day. She took the box out to her car, and I danced with my daddy's brother because my daddy was 11 years gone. And my mother sat at table 4 in a blue dress with a corsage and her hands folded in her lap like a mitten, and she was the last person to leave. 3 days later, Margine came by our apartment over the laundromat on Cedar. She had a zippered bank bag, and she set it on the counter, and she said, That's what it came to. $1,160. And she said, "People don't give money anymore, honey. Y'all mostly got cards." I have thought about that afternoon so many times that it's gone shiny, like a step. Jimmy was on the couch with his boots off. He said something like, "Well, that's all right," and it wasn't all right, and I could hear in his voice that it wasn't. He'd told the guys on his route we were going to Gulf Shores. We did not go to Gulf Shores. We went to his cousin's camp on the Coosa for 2 nights and came back Sunday because he had a Monday. And here's the part that has cost me the most sleep, and I'm going to say it plain instead of easing into it. I said thank you. I stood in my own kitchen with $1,160 in a bank bag, and I thanked her for going to the trouble. And I meant it. And she said, "It was no trouble at all, honey." And she took her bag back because it was her bank bag, and she left. That's the story. Everything after this is just how long it took me to find out. Now, if you've ever taken a number from somebody and never once thought to check it, because checking it would have meant thinking something about a person you weren't willing to think, you already know where the next 12 years went. Down in the comments, tell me the number somebody handed you that you never checked. And stay with me, because the thing that finally made me count wasn't suspicion. It was a guest book, and I only got it down off the shelf because I was crying about my mother. 12 years is a long time to describe, and it went by like a Tuesday. Sadie came the first year, while we were still over the laundromat. I went back on the floor 11 days after I had her, and Dottie let me put her in a car seat on the shelf in the back where the pie boxes go, and Peggy would rock her with her foot while she called in tickets. We got out of that apartment after 4 years, and into a rented house on Pinson Street with a carport and a pecan tree. And we're still in it, and the landlords raised us twice. Jimmy's truck went out at $190,000, and he rode with a fellow off Highway 9 for 8 months. We put a roof on with a home equity thing. That wasn't home equity because we don't own the house. It was just a loan with a nicer name on it. Sadie needed a trombone. Sadie needed braces, and did not get braces. And all through it there was the family, and the family was warm. And I want to be careful here because this is where people expect me to describe a monster, and there wasn't one. There were Sunday dinners with too much food. There was Margene bringing a chicken casserole to the house anytime anybody so much as sneezed. She came to every single one of Sadie's concerts, front row, and she has a photograph of that child on her hall table in a frame. There is one of me in that house. It's the wedding portrait, and it's got Jimmy in it. And there was a thing that happened at every gathering that I noticed maybe the 4th or 5th year and then could not stop noticing, which is the only kind of noticing that counts. When something needed paying for, the family did not discuss it. They looked, not at me exactly, toward me, like a room turning toward a window when the light changes. The church van fund, the flowers for Melvin's marker. Shelby's hygienist certificate at 26 when her aid fell through, which was $600 I put on a card and which nobody has mentioned again in 7 years. When Margene's water heater burst, it was Jimmy and me at 8 at night with a wet vac, and when her transmission went, it was our $1,400, and she cried and hugged my neck and called me the good one, and I drove home feeling like somebody had finally seen me. Being called the good one. That's what I was buying, and I'd have told you it was free. I never asked for any of it back. I want to be clear that this story is not about a woman who is owed. Every one of those was a thing I chose, and I'd choose most of them again. And if the story stopped here, it wouldn't be a story, it'd be a marriage. Then 2 years ago, my mother died. She was 73, and it was her heart, which surprised nobody but me. She'd been up on a stepladder taking the storm windows off. My neighbor found her. And I want to skip this part, and I'm not going to, because you can't understand the freezer if you don't sit in the office with me. Same funeral home. Different man in the good suit, younger, decent, did not push me one time. And I sat in the chair my mother had sat in when she was 53, and I picked out the second cheapest of everything, and it came to $6,850. I had $2,500 and change. I put $4,300 on a credit card in that office, with the man being very kind about the machine, and I have been paying on it since. A year and a half of paying. At 24.5%, which, if you've never carried one, means the balance is stubborn. It was $3,140 the week of Shelby's wedding, and I could have told you that figure at any hour of any day without looking, the way you can tell somebody where your tooth hurts. And here's the thing I did that I'm going to make you sit with. 2 weeks after the funeral, I went out to my mother's house to start on it, and I went to the deep freeze on the back porch, and I dug down past the butter beans, and the bread bag was not there. I want you to know exactly what I thought, because it matters later. I stood on that porch with the lid up and the cold coming out at me, and I thought, she spent it. Of course she spent it. She'd had the roof patched. She'd had the car twice. The plant took her insurance when they cut her to part-time at 66, and not one word of that ever reached me. Because that was the whole architecture of that woman. She'd have gone without heat before. She'd have let me know she was cold. So I closed the freezer, and I stood there, and I forgave my mother for something she had not done. That's the sentence I choke on. For a year and a half, I carried a soft, sad, generous little idea in my head that my mother had quietly spent her own burial money on her own hard life, and that I was proud of her for it, and that the card in my wallet was mine to carry because of it. She never spent a dime of it. Now, let me take you to last winter, when Shelby got engaged. His name's Travis Lunsford, and he teaches ag at the county high school, and he is, and I mean this, a good one. Big, slow hands, laughs at himself first. He came into the kettle by himself about a month before the engagement, and sat at the counter and asked me what Shelby's mama was going to be like about a ring, and I gave him the truth, which was that whatever he picked out, she'd tell him it was beautiful, and then tell somebody else what she'd have picked. The wedding was set for the second Saturday in May, out at Yarnell Farm, which by then had been a wedding venue for 6 years, and had a tent and a gravel lot and lights strung on poles, 206 invitations. A caterer out of Anniston, a band, not a DJ, which Margene mentioned in a way that let you know it was not a DJ. And on a Sunday in February, at Marjan's table, before we ate, she went to the sideboard and brought out the box. I hadn't seen it in 12 years. She set it in the middle of the table on a folded towel so it wouldn't scratch the wood, and she put her hand flat on the lid, and she said, 4 marriages in this family have started out of this box. Shelby said something about how she loved that. Travis said, yes, ma'am. Jimmy's cousins took a picture of it. And I sat there with a spoon in my hand, and something went through me that I did not have a name for, and I want to describe it accurately because it wasn't suspicion, not yet. It was closer to what you feel when you hear a song from the year somebody died. It was my own hands. I was standing at the end of a table with my shoes in my hand. I didn't say anything at that dinner. I dried dishes and I drove home, and Sadie fell asleep in the back, and Jimmy and I talked about tires. And at 11 o'clock that night, I got the wedding album down off the shelf in our closet. Now, why? Because seeing that box put me back in that fellowship hall, and being back in that fellowship hall meant my mother was in a blue dress at table 4, and I have not been able to look at pictures of her since the funeral. I got the album down to hurt myself a little. That is the honest reason. There are nights you go looking for the bruise. And I sat on the closet floor and turned pages and cried the way you do at 11 o'clock, and then I got to the back, and the guest book's not a separate book, it's bound into the album, 4 pages of lines. I don't know why I counted. I have thought about this, and I don't have an answer any better than this one. I count for a living. Give me a room and a stack of anything, and my thumb starts moving. Covers, tickets, chairs, I counted the way you'd hum. 138 names. And tucked in behind the last page, folded in fourths, going soft at the creases, was my thank you list. I'd made it myself the week after the wedding, at that kitchen table over the laundromat, with the gift table in one column and the person in the other so I wouldn't miss anybody. Because my mother had raised me to believe that a person who doesn't write a thank you note is a person who thinks the thing came from the store instead of from a human being. 41 lines, The toaster, the towels, the 3 crock pots, the everyday dishes. 41. I sat on that closet floor, and I did the arithmetic that any 5th grader could do, and that I had not done in 12 years. And the number that came out the other end was 97. 97 people came to my wedding, and I never wrote to one of them. And listen to me now, because this is the part that had nothing to do with money, and it's the part that got up off the floor with me. For 12 years, I have poured coffee for this town. And somewhere out in it, there were 97 people who put something in an envelope for a girl from the Plant family who married a Blevins and who had been sitting at my counter ever since, being perfectly nice to me, and thinking I was the kind of woman who couldn't be bothered. I had wondered about that. That's what I couldn't get past. I had actually wondered about it, for years. In a low way, I never examined a certain thinness in how some people were with me. A woman at the pharmacy who was always a half a beat cool. Jimmy's aunt who stopped sending Christmas cards after 2 years, and I assumed it was because we'd moved. I decided all of that was about me being from the Plant side. If you have ever explained somebody's coldness to yourself with a story about your own worth, put a word in the comments, because I'd like to know how many of us there are. And subscribe before this next part, because what I found under a stack of tablecloths in that woman's sewing room is the reason I'm telling this at all. I woke Jimmy up. He sat on the edge of the bed rubbing his face, and I said, "What did we get at our wedding?" He said, "What?" I said, "Money. What did people give us?" And my husband, who could not tell you what he had for supper Tuesday, said it without 1 second of hunting for it. 1160. Then he sat there a minute in the dark, and he said, "I told Dewey and them we were going to Gulf Shores, 12 years, and he'd kept that. That's what I mean about the number being small. It wasn't the money. It was that a 29-year-old man had told the fellows on his route where he was taking his wife, and then had to walk it back on a Monday morning, and had carried that by himself for 12 years until 11 o'clock at night in the dark. I told him about the guest book and the 41. He got very quiet. Then he said the thing that was true and that I did not want. He said, "Mama would have counted. She'd have opened every one of them and counted, that's just how she is. She'd have known to the dollar." And I said, "That's my point, Lon." And he said, "No, I mean she'd have known, so there's an explanation." That's the whole of my husband in one sentence, and I'm not going to make him a villain for it. When Jimmy hits a wall, he assumes there's a door, and he starts feeling along it in the dark. He wasn't defending her yet. He was just certain, the way a boy is certain, that the world his mother ran was a world where things added up. We didn't do a thing for 3 weeks. That belongs in here, because people always want to know why you didn't just march over there. I'll tell you why. Because I could still make it come out fine. Maybe 138 people came, and 97 of them brought a dish instead. Maybe folks in this town really don't give money. Maybe I'd counted a page twice. I made myself a list of ways it was fine, and I went to work every morning at 5:30 and carried plates for people whose names might be in a box somewhere, and I did not look at any of them any differently, and that's the last stretch of my life where that was true. Then Margene called me on a Thursday, the 2nd week of March, and asked me to go up to her sewing room and get the good tablecloths out of the chest. That's how it happened. She called me. She had her knee done in January, and stairs were still a project, and there were 4 card tables coming for the shower, and she needed the cutwork cloths that had been her mother-in-law's, and she called the one person in that family who does what she's asked without being asked twice. "Sit in that with me a minute," she sent me. She has sent me up those stairs for 12 years, and it never crossed her mind that I would be a person who looks at anything, because I'm the one who fetches. You do not think about your own hand. The sewing room's the little bedroom over the carport, and it's got a machine in it, and a dress form, and about $900 of quilting cotton in stacks, and under the window there's a cedar chest with a cushion on the lid. The cloths were right on top, folded in tissue. I got them out, and under where they'd been, there was a hatbox. It was a round hatbox, the striped cardboard kind, and the lid didn't sit flat because the box was too full. and I picked the lid up the way you'd pick up anything you were told to leave alone, which is to say, without deciding to. Envelopes. Not one, not a stack. Full to the lid, standing on their edges, packed so tight the box had gone oval. Some of them were the little cards and envelopes kind. Some were plain white. Some had gone the color of weak tea. And every single one of them had handwriting on the front, and every single one of that handwriting was somebody I knew. The kettle. Dottie's hand, which slants backward. Peggy's, which has hearts over the eyes, which at 58 is a decision. A man I've served eggs to 4 days a week for 19 years, who signs his name in all capitals because he did 40 years of paperwork on a clipboard. And they were sealed, every one of them, 12 years, and not one of them had been opened. I'd like to tell you what my body did, because I've had 6 months to think about it. I didn't gasp. I got very cold across the back of my shoulders, the exact way you do at the plant, which I have only been inside of twice in my life, both times to bring my mother her lunch. I stood in that little room with the sun coming through the shears, and I thought, this is a room in a house I have eaten Sunday dinner in for 12 years. I did not count them. I did not take one. I want to be straight about that, not because I'm proud of it, but because I've wondered since whether I should have. I put the lid back on. I put the tissue back the way it was. I carried the tablecloths down those stairs, and Marjan was at the bottom. And she looked up at me and said, "Did you find them all right, honey?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she said, "Well, you're a peach." I drove home and sat in the carport with the engine off for 20 minutes, and then I went in and made supper. Now here's the part where I'd like to tell you I was strategic. I wasn't. I did the thing I do, which is the thing my mother did and her mother before her, which is to go straight at a person with the assumption that there's a reasonable answer and that you're about to be embarrassed. I went back on Saturday morning with a coffee cake. She was glad to see me. She put the pot on. We talked about the shower and about whether Travis's people were coming Friday night or Saturday. And then I put both hands around my cup and I said, "Marjan, there's a hatbox in your cedar chest with the envelopes from my wedding in it." She did not blink. She did not pause. And I have replayed those next 4 minutes more than I've replayed my own wedding, because the script was already loaded. There was no hunting. There was no what box. She went straight into it like a woman stepping onto a road she's walked at night. First, she made it small. "Oh, honey, that old thing. That's just papers." Then she made it mine. "You went in my chest?" Then she made it the family's. And this is the one I'd like you to hear, because it's the actual belief, and everything else is decoration. She said, "That money was never yours and Jimmy's. That's family money. That comes in at a wedding and it stays in the family and it goes back out at the next one. That's how it's done. That's how it was done when I married, and nobody had to explain it to me." I said, "Ma'am, there's 138 people's names in my guest book, and I wrote 41 thank you notes." And she said, "And I need you to hear the pivot, because this is where it stopped being about money." She said, "Well, you could have asked me for the cards any time in 12 years. I said, "I didn't know there were cards." And she said, "You didn't ask." Then came the account of what she has carried. And I'm not going to be cute about this part, because a lot of it was true. She held that family together after Melvin died with a church salary. She has cooked for every funeral in that congregation for 31 years, including my mother's. And I ate her chicken and dressing at my own mother's funeral, and it was good, and she brought it herself in her own dishes. And then, at the end of it, with her hand on the table, she delivered the verdict, and it took 11 words. She said, "You've always been funny about money, honey. Your mother was too." That's when I quit asking. I want to explain what that sentence did, because from the outside, it's nothing. It's a little nothing. But that woman had known Imogene Dockery for 6 years. My mother came to that house maybe 9 times. And in those 9 times, what she did was stand up too early to help with dishes and refuse to sit while anybody else was working, because she'd spent 26 years on a line and she did not know how to be waited on. And that had been read and filed and put where it was going to stay, And 12 years later, it came back at me across a coffee cake as evidence. You've always been funny about money. Your mother was too. She was funny about money the way a woman is funny about air after she's been underwater. I got up. I thanked her for the coffee, which I want you to notice, and which I did, because I was raised by that same funny woman. And I drove to the cemetery instead of home, and sat in the car at the fence, and didn't get out. Here's what the next 6 weeks looked like. Some of you can recite it with me. Jimmy went to see her. He wanted to. I didn't push him, and I want that in the record, because it's the only reason we're still married. He was gone about an hour and a half, and he came back and stood in the kitchen with his hat still on and said, "She's going to make it right at the wedding." I said, "Meaning what, exactly?" He said, "She's going to settle it up at the wedding, in front of everybody. She said she'd rather do it where people can see it than have it be a whispered thing." And I looked at my husband and I understood that he had been given a thing to carry home and had carried it, and that he believed it, and that he was so relieved he was almost happy. So we let it ride to the wedding. Write that down. That's the whole hinge of this story, and it is not a clever thing I did. I set nothing. I baited nothing. Tonya Blevins picked the room, picked the date, picked the audience, and told her son in her own kitchen that she wanted it done where people could see. All I did was not warn her. Meanwhile, the town did what a town does. Shelby called me on a Tuesday night in April, and she was crying before I said hello, and she said, "Please don't do this at my wedding." And I said, "Shelby, I'm not doing anything at your wedding." And she said, "Mama says you're upset about some cards from 12 years ago, and this is the one day, Tonya." Every family has a phrase, and ours is the one day. Everything is the one day. A wedding, a funeral, a Christmas, somebody's 60th. There is a permanent one day in that family, and the only rule is that nothing true can be said inside of it, and there is no day that isn't one. Jimmy's cousins got quiet with me. Not rude, quiet. Aunt in Georgia sent a text with no punctuation. And I kept opening the kettle at 5:30, and I kept looking at that counter, and now every face on it had a question behind it that I could not ask, because how do you ask a man eating his eggs whether he put money in an envelope for you 12 years ago? I want to give Marjen her paragraph now, because I've told you what she did and I haven't told you why, and the story's dishonest without it. The spring of 1988, Melvin Blevins signed his name on a note for his brother-in-law's equipment business, not Burl. The other side, Marjan's people. And it went under, and the note came around to the Blevinses, and they sold the hardware store on the square with the gold leaf in the transom that Melvin's grandfather put in, and they did it in 9 weeks. Marjan found out on a Tuesday. That's the part Burl told me later. She found out on a Tuesday afternoon from a man who came to the door, because her husband had not told her. And she was 37 years old with 3 children and a house payment, and she had signed nothing and been asked nothing. She has not let anything out of her hand since. That's not a figure of speech. That house is full of other people's things she's holding. There's a christening gown in that chest for a baby who's 19 years old now and works at the tire place. There's a set of keys on a nail by her back door, and nobody in that family can tell you what they open. I believe every word of it. It explains a great deal about a woman who was left out of the one decision that broke her life, and who decided that from then on, she'd be the one holding. And there's nothing in that Tuesday in 1988 that put my mother's envelope in a hatbox and kept it sealed for 12 years. That was not 1988. That was 4,300 mornings, and on every single one of them she could have carried that box down the stairs. And she didn't. And by the end, she wasn't even keeping it. She'd forgotten it the way you forget a thing you own. If you're still with me, hit subscribe now, because everything from here happens in about 4 minutes under a tent, and there's one sentence in it from an 81-year-old man that I'd trade a good deal to hear again. The second Saturday in May came up hot and clear. I was out at Yarnell Farm at 7 in the morning with a box of mason jars, because the caterer's people don't do the tables, and somebody has to do the tables. Peggy came out and helped me for 2 hours on her own day off and would not take gas money. We put out 206 place settings, and we tied a sprig of rosemary on every napkin because that's what Shelby wanted, and my hands smelled like it until Tuesday. Sadie was in a green dress and had a job, which was the programs. 11 years old, standing at the end of the aisle handing out programs with her grandmother's hands, and I stood in the gravel lot and watched her do it and had a thought I'm not proud of and am not going to hide, which is, there she goes. The ceremony was at 4 and it was pretty. Travis cried and Shelby didn't, and everybody said afterward that was exactly right. Burl sat on the aisle with his hearing aid off and clapped when the people around him clapped. Supper, toasts. Travis's daddy gave one, and it was too long and it was lovely. The band started, the cake came out, and a little after 7, Tonya Blevins stood up and asked the band for the microphone. She was in navy with a jacket, and she'd polished that box, and she had it up in both arms with the lid open, the way you hold a hymnal for somebody who can't. She never did set it down. I've thought about that a good deal since. There was a table right at her hip the whole time, and it did not occur to her, and I don't believe it ever once has. She said, 4 marriages in this family have started out of this box. She said something about her mother-in-law and the man in Del Camp who made it. She said the Blevinses had been in this county 130 years, and that what a family is a place where nothing has to be carried by one person. And people were smiling. People were nodding. My husband was standing at my left shoulder with a plate in his hand, and I understood, right about then, what he'd carried home to me in March. This was it. This was her settling up. The money was going where money goes in that family at the next wedding, out of the same box, in front of the whole county and in her arithmetic that squared it, and it had never once crossed her mind that anybody would want it handed back instead. I could see into the box from where I stood, 6 feet away, and the light was on it, envelopes, standing on edge, and the one on top, out front, laid flat across the others, like it had been put there last. My mother printed. She never learned to write pretty, and she was ashamed of it, so she printed, in capitals, small and square and pressing too hard. And there's nothing else in this world I'd mistake for it. Tonya and Jimmy Blevins. The ends backward-leaning. The pen gone dry at the top of the B, and pressed hard to bring it back. I said it before I decided to. Ma'am, that one's mine. The tent went the way a room goes when somebody drops a glass. Margene looked at me down the whole length of it over the punch bowl, over 200 rosemary napkins I'd tied myself that morning, over every person I've served breakfast to since I was 22, and she used her church voice on me. Sit down, Tonya. You've had your day. And this is the place where I stopped the story on you at the beginning, so let me take you through it now, because it kept going. I did not sit down. I didn't get loud either, and not out of any nobleness I haven't got a loud voice. I've spent 19 years talking to people across 3 feet of counter, I said. The one on top's from my mother. She's been gone a year and a half. May I have it? And Tonya Blevins looked down into that box, and something happened on her face that I had never seen on it in 12 years and have not seen since. It softened. She was not caught. She was remembering. She said, "Oh, that one." And then she said it into a microphone, in front of 206 people, with real feeling, the way you'd tell somebody about a photograph. She said, "I never could bring myself to open that one. The tent did the arithmetic. You could hear it do it." 200 people worked out, in about a second and a half, that a woman was standing at a wedding holding a sealed envelope from a dead woman, and that she'd had it long enough to have feelings about it. And I said, "Then let me." I walked up there. Nobody stopped me. Travis stepped back and put his hand on Shelby's arm, and Shelby had both hands over her mouth, and I took that envelope off the top of the stack, and I did not touch another one. The flap had gone loose at one corner from 12 years in a cedar chest, and it came open under my thumb without tearing. Cash, folded flat, a rubber band around it, and the band had gone to dust the way they do, and broke when I touched it, and left a gray line across the top bill. $4,000. And a card, not a wedding card, the kind of blank card with a bird on it that comes 6 to a box at the dollar store. I read it out loud because I was already standing at a microphone and because I had gone somewhere past deciding things. Tonya, it's the butterbean money. Don't you dare bring it back. And don't tell Marjan where it came from. She'll find a reason it's hers. Mama. You have to understand that at least 60 people under that tent knew what butterbean money was, because my mother said it in the kettle, and at the plant, and at the Methodist church for 30 years. Somewhere behind me, a woman said, "Oh, no," out loud, the way you do at a wreck. Marjan got to the tears first. She said she'd held this family together since before I was born. Then she went to blame, and she reached for the closest thing, which was her own son. She said Jimmy knew. Ask Jimmy. Jimmy's known for years, and my husband said, in a voice that came out of a part of him I'd never met, "Mama, that's not so." Then she found the last one. She straightened up, and her hands went to her waist, folded, and she said, "I am the mother of this family, and I decide what stays in it." And Burl Blevins turned his hearing aid on. You could hear it whine. He did it slow, the way he does, with 2 fingers, and 81 years of not being in a hurry, and he said, "Marjan, I put $200 in an envelope at that girl's wedding. I've spent 12 years thinking she never thought enough of me to say thank you. That's the whole of it, right there. One old man on the aisle who'd been quietly hurt for 12 years by something that never happened. And then Shelby, my sister-in-law, on her own wedding day, in her own dress, reached over and closed the lid of that box. She said, 'Mama, I'm not starting on that.' And she took it out of her mother's arms and handed it to Jimmy. And my husband took it under his arm like a man carrying a dog out of the road. I put my mother's card in my pocket, and I said the one thing I'd had ready for 8 weeks without knowing what it was for. I said, 'You told me a family's a place to set things down, Marjan. I'm taking the one thing in there that was already on its way to me.' And I went and found Sadie and told her Mama's tired, and we drove home. And I made her a grilled cheese at 10 o'clock at night, because neither one of us had eaten at that wedding. Here's how the rest of it went, and it went fast, the way things do once the paper's moving. Jimmy put the box on our kitchen table at 11:30 that night, and we opened 94 envelopes. $9,440, $6,190 of it cash, $3,250 in checks, and I took those to the bank on Monday and stood at Gail Sowell's window. And she was decent about it, and looked it up twice before she told me, a check goes stale after 6 months, and that's not the bank being ugly. That's just what a check is. So that's $3,250 of paper, and it's in a shoebox in my closet, and I've kept every one because there's a name on it. Marjan gave us $1,160 12 years ago, and kept $8,280. I've done that subtraction so many times it's worn a groove. Nobody called the law. I want to say that plainly, because people ask. She's 74. It was a gift box at a wedding. There's no receipt in this world for what goes in one, and I would not have done it if there had been. What I wanted was never a case. What I wanted was the names. I wrote 93 thank you notes that June. 94 envelopes, and one of them I couldn't answer, 12 years late. I did it at the kitchen table over about 5 weeks, 4 or 5 a night. And I wrote the same 3 things in every one, what they gave, that I only just found out, and thank you. I didn't explain past that. It wasn't their business, and the town had it inside of a week anyway. 31 people wrote me back. Aubrey Pate didn't write. He just put his hand on my wrist at the counter on a Wednesday morning and said, "Well, there she is," and let go. Marjan Blevins still runs the Methodist kitchen. She has not apologized, and I've stopped waiting on one, because I finally understood she doesn't think there's a thing to apologize for in her arithmetic. She held family money for a family, and then tried to hand it out at a wedding, and the only thing that went wrong was me. Jimmy drove for a month. He went back up to that sewing room the Tuesday after the wedding and emptied the cedar chest all the way to the bottom, and then he spent 4 weekends carrying things back to people. The christening gown went to a 19-year-old at the tire place who did not know what it was. He never told me what the keys opened, and I don't think he ever found out, and I've decided that's the truest thing in this whole story. He goes over there, Sundays, by himself, most weeks. I told him to. She's his mother, and I'm not going to be a woman who makes a man choose. And Sadie sees her at her concerts, in the front row, where she has always been. I don't go in that house. That's not a punishment, and I don't announce it. It's just that I'm 41 years old, and I've got a finite number of Sundays. 6 months on, here's where it all landed. I paid the funeral card off in July. $3,140 out of my mother's $4,000 on a Tuesday morning, on my phone, sitting in my car in the kettle lot before shift with the engine running. It took about 40 seconds, 20 months of it, gone in the time it takes to warm a truck up. So my mother buried herself after all, 12 years late and by way of another woman's cedar chest. But she did it exactly the way she'd planned to, on a back porch in 1990-something, with a bread bag and a bag of butter beans. The 2,190 that wasn't my mother's went to a stone. She'd had one of those temporary markers, the little metal frame with the card in it, for 2 years, because that was what I could do at the time. The man at the monument place asked what I wanted cut under her name, and I said nothing. Just the name and the 2 dates. She'd have thought paying by the letter for a saying was money out the window, and she'd have been right, and I could hear her say it standing in that showroom. The rest of it, $860, is in a bread bag in my deep freeze on the back porch on Pinson Street, under a bag of butter beans, with a strip of masking tape on it that says, Sadie. She knows it's there. That was the point. My mother hid hers, and I have decided I'm not going to hide mine. And there's a difference between the two of us right there that I could talk about for an hour and won't. The card with the bird on it is in a frame on the wall by my sink, where I stand the most. I did not frame the money, and I did not frame the envelope. I framed the 3 lines, and the one I see from the sink is the middle one. Don't you dare bring it back. I used to think holding something for somebody was one of the kind things you could do for a person. Now I know the holding was never the kindness. The handing back is the kindness. And it has a date on it, and the date is the day they ask. That's my story. 1 walnut box, 94 envelopes that stayed sealed for 12 years, and a bread bag under the butter beans. So here's the practical thing, and I mean do it this week. If somebody in your family is holding something of yours, money, papers, a ring, a deposit, a box you haven't laid eyes on since a wedding or a funeral call, and ask for it back, don't accuse anybody of anything. Just ask for it, out loud, and put a day on it. A thing that's being held is supposed to come back, and asking is the only way on God's earth anybody finds out. Share this with the one in your family who's always in the kitchen when everybody else is in the den. And tell me down in the comments what somebody's still holding for you. I read them, and I'd like to know how many of us are out here saying thank you for our own money. Then hit subscribe. That's all of it. Thank you for sitting with me on the porch tonight. I'll see you in the next one.